The conflict that proved humanity was the galaxy's ultimate predator. My name is Vale Reth. I am a senior intelligence analyst for the Chorath Dominion, and I have spent 31 years of my life cataloging the behaviors, weapons, and psychological profiles of every known species in the cataloged galaxy. I have read battle reports from 14 wars. I have studied the collapse of 3 separate civilizations. I have interviewed warlords, diplomats, merchants, refugees, and spies. I believed, for a long time, that I understood the full range of what intelligent life could produce. I was wrong. The alert came at 0312 Standard Time, deep into the night cycle of the observation platform where I was stationed. The platform sat at the edge of the Vorkai contested zone, a stretch of space that had been burning for 60 years. 4 empires had been pouring blood and metal into that region for 6 decades without anyone winning or losing enough to stop. The Chorath Dominion, the Veth Collective, the Scaran Theocracy, the Mern Republic. 4 powers, 4 agendas, 4 sets of grievances that went back so far that most soldiers fighting the war could not even name the original cause. They just knew they were supposed to fight, and so they did. I had been stationed on the observation platform for 11 months, watching the slow and grinding machinery of that war, sending reports back to Chorath's high command, and trying to find patterns in chaos. It was exhausting work. The contested zone was a mess of debris fields, abandoned stations, and shifting front lines. Nothing ever changed fast enough to be interesting, and nothing ever stayed the same long enough to be stable. And then the sensors screamed. I was on my second cup of something the platform's food synthesizer insisted was a warm beverage, and I was reviewing supply movement data from the previous 48 hours, when every alert system on my console lit up at once. Not a weapons discharge, not a missile lock. A new contact. Something had appeared at the outer edge of the zone's northern quadrant, and it had appeared without any warning at all. No FTL signature buildup, no gravitational ripple in the expected direction. One moment there was empty space, and the next moment there was a ship. My first thought was that it was a sensor malfunction. I ran a diagnostic. The sensors were fine. I called the night shift technician, a young Chorath named Dreven, who was very good at his job and never panicked, and I asked him to look at the readings independently from his own station. He called back in 40 seconds. His voice was careful, in a way that told me he was working very hard to sound calm. "It is a real contact," he said. "Single vessel. Configuration does not match anything in the database. Mass reading suggests a warship class. It is sitting still." I pulled up the visual feed and magnified it as far as the platform's systems would allow. The image was grainy at that distance, but what I could see made me set down my warm beverage very slowly and stare. The ship was ugly. I want to be precise about that, because in my career I have seen warships from a dozen civilizations, and they all have a certain aesthetic logic to them, even the brutal ones. Veth warships are sleek and angular, because the Veth believe that efficiency and beauty are the same thing. Scaran vessels are heavily ornamented, because the Scaran Theocracy sees its fleet as a temple made mobile. Even Mern warships, which are purely functional, have a symmetry to them that reflects the Republic's love of order. Every ship I had ever seen told you something about the people who built it. This ship looked like it had been built in a hurry, repaired under fire, and then refused to die. The hull was asymmetrical in a way that seemed almost accidental. There were sections of the outer plating that were clearly newer than the sections around them, as if pieces had been replaced mid-conflict, and no one had painted them to match. I could see scoring along the port side that I recognized as energy weapon burns. Old ones, the kind that had been there long enough to become part of the ship's identity rather than a fresh wound. The whole vessel had a quality I struggled to name at first, and then I found the word, endurance. It looked like something that had been through many terrible things, and had simply kept going. I filed an immediate report to High Command, and began the standard contact protocol. I sent a query across all known communication frequencies, using every greeting format in the diplomatic database. I got nothing back for 4 minutes. Then, on a frequency that was slightly outside our standard range, something came through. Not a greeting, not a weapons lock, not a demand. Coordinates. Just coordinates, broadcast clearly and repeatedly, on a loop. A location in neutral space, roughly equidistant from the current front lines of all 4 warring empires. The broadcast included a time marker, a meeting, not a challenge, not an ultimatum, a meeting. Within 6 minutes, my console showed me that the Veth Collective's border stations had picked up the transmission. Within 9 minutes, I was reading intercepts that told me the Scaran theocracy had scrambled an analysis team. Within 15 minutes, Mern Republic Signals Intelligence was clearly working the same problem I was, because their communication traffic spiked in ways I recognized from experience. The entire contested zone went quiet. Not completely, because wars do not simply pause, and there were still skirmishes at the southern line and a supply convoy that the Veth had been tracking for days. But the part of the zone's activity that involved high command decision-making, the part that involved the people who actually ran things on each side, went very quiet, in a way that told me everyone was doing the same thing I was. They were searching their databases. They were trying to find information on this ship, on the species that had sent it, on the civilization that could appear in the middle of a 60-year war, with no introduction, except a set of coordinates. My database returned very little. The entry for humanity was a stub, the kind of file that exists because someone once heard the name and entered it into the system, without enough information to fill it out properly. Approximately 9 billion individuals. Homeworld cataloged. Biological classification on record. Technological assessment, incomplete. Military capacity, unknown. Diplomatic posture, unknown. Political structure, multiple, evolving. That last line is the one that stayed with me. Multiple, evolving. Most species, when they reach the point where they can build a vessel capable of traveling between star systems, have consolidated into a single governing structure, or at least a small number of stable ones. It is almost a rule. The resource and coordination demands of interstellar travel tend to force unity. The fact that humanity's political structure was still listed as multiple evolving meant either that the database entry was very old and outdated, or that humanity was genuinely different from what I expected. I flagged this for my report, but I did not yet understand why it mattered. I would, later. High Command responded to my initial report within the hour. Their instructions were characteristically direct. I was to attend the meeting at the given coordinates, as Chorath's representative. I was considered, as my supervisor Colonel Hayan Vor put it, observant enough to be useful, and junior enough to be replaceable. I appreciated his honesty. I was not important enough that Chorath would be embarrassed if things went wrong, but I was experienced enough to actually tell them what I saw. I prepared for the meeting with the thoroughness my training required. I reviewed everything in the database about human biology, which was not much. Bipedal, omnivorous, shorter lifespan than most spacefaring species, remarkable physiological tolerance for a variety of environmental conditions. One note in the xenobiology section, added by some analyst I had never heard of, caught my eye. It said, "Subject species demonstrates unusual capacity for sustained effort under physical stress. Psychological response to perceived threat shows high variability, ranging from paralysis to extreme aggression to complex social bonding. Predator origin species." I had seen predator origin species in files before. It was not especially rare. Many spacefaring species came from evolutionary lines that had once been hunters. What was unusual was the specific phrasing of that variability note, ranging from paralysis to extreme aggression to complex social bonding. Most predator origin species settled into one of those three responses as their dominant cultural mode. The fact that humanity apparently used all three, depending on circumstances, was something I filed under interesting, but not yet interpretable. The journey to the neutral coordinates took 11 hours at the observation platform's transport speed. I traveled on a small diplomatic shuttle, alone except for my pilot, a quiet professional named Corin, who had been flying diplomatic missions for 20 years and had developed the enviable quality of never being surprised by anything. I spent the 11 hours reviewing my notes and trying to build a profile of what I might encounter. I could not do it. I did not have enough information. This, I would later understand, was exactly what the humans intended. The neutral station was an old Mern structure from before the war, back when the Republic had believed that building neutral infrastructure might prevent conflict. It had been abandoned for 40 years. Someone had recently brought the life support systems back online. I did not know who had done this. Later, I found out it was the humans. They had come to the neutral station before any of us. quietly restored the basic systems and waited. I am still not entirely certain how long they had been waiting. The station's logs, when I eventually accessed them, had gaps. I arrived to find 3 other shuttles already docked. The Veth Collective had sent Ambassador Keth Orvan, a diplomat of considerable seniority and considerable arrogance, with a staff of 6. The Skaran Theocracy had sent High Cleric Orvan, who served a dual role as both religious authority and military liaison, with a ceremonial guard of 12. The Mern Republic had sent General Fasik Dran, a short and deeply unimpressed-looking military commander with a background in strategic planning, and he had brought 4 aides. And then there were the humans. Admiral Kara Vasquez stood in the center of the station's main meeting room, as if she had always been there, as if the room had been built around her, rather than the other way around. She was not physically imposing by the standards of most species I had encountered. She was of average height for a human, which made her shorter than me, and considerably shorter than the Skaran Guard. She wore a dress uniform that had clearly been pressed for the occasion, but still had the quality of a working garment, something worn often, rather than something kept in a case for ceremonies. There was a small patch of discoloration on the left sleeve that the fabric's cleaning cycle had not entirely removed. My analyst's eye told me it was from something hot, something that had splashed or burned at close range. She had 2 escorts, both unarmed, both standing slightly behind her and to either side, relaxed but attentive, not ceremonial, not intimidating, just present. Every other delegation in the room had brought status with them. Ambassador Keth Orvan wore the full diplomatic regalia of the Veth Collective, which involved a significant amount of layered fabric and several medallions, indicating his rank and the rank of those he served. High Cleric Orvan was dressed in the Skaran Theocracy's ceremonial armor, gold inlaid and imposing, designed to communicate that he served a power both divine and military. General Fasik Dran wore his Republic dress uniform, which was austere by design, because the Mern Republic considered austerity its own form of status communication. Admiral Vasquez wore her uniform, and she smiled at all of us as we entered, and the smile was the most disarming thing I had seen in 31 years of working in intelligence. It was not a diplomatic smile. I knew diplomatic smiles. I had practiced them in mirrors. A diplomatic smile is a controlled instrument, deployed with calculation, designed to communicate warmth while revealing nothing. What Vasquez had was something different. It was the smile of someone who was genuinely pleased to see you and was not working at all to conceal the fact. It made every other person in the room uncomfortable. I watched it happen. Ambassador Keth Orvan, who had been preparing a formal greeting in the Veth diplomatic tradition, which involved significant throat clearing and a 2-minute opening statement of his credentials, stopped when he saw that smile and blinked twice in rapid succession. High Cleric Orvan's left hand moved slightly toward the ceremonial weapon at his side and then stopped, because there was no threat to respond to. But something about that smile had triggered a response anyway. General Fasik Dran just stared. I took my seat at the meeting table and wrote 2 words in my observation log: not performing. Because that was the key thing. Every single one of us in that room, myself included, had spent the journey here performing a role. Ambassador, general, cleric, analyst. We had dressed ourselves in the symbols of our functions and our organizations and our empires, and we had arranged our faces and our postures to communicate the appropriate messages about power and seriousness. This was normal. This was how every important meeting in the galaxy worked. Admiral Vasquez was not performing anything. She was simply there, and somehow that was more unsettling than any performance could have been. She let everyone settle. She did not rush. She did not fill the silence with chatter or pleasantries. She simply waited with that expression on her face, patient and present, until everyone was seated and had stopped moving, and the room was still. Then she said, in clear and unaccented Standard Galactic, "Thank you all for coming. I know it was not a short trip for anyone. My name is Kara Vasquez. I'm here on behalf of Earth and its aligned territories. I'd like to show you something." She slid a datapad to the center of the table. No preamble, no credential listing, no statement of her rank or the importance of her civilization. No diplomatic tradition I had ever encountered allowed for this kind of directness. It was, by the standards of every empire in that room, almost rude. And yet none of us looked away from the datapad. It sat in the center of the table, flat and still, and for a moment, nobody moved toward it. Then General Fasik Dran, who I had already assessed as someone who made decisions quickly and lived with the consequences, leaned forward and picked it up. His face did something I had not seen it do since I entered the room. It went still. Not blank, not the careful blankness of concealment, but genuinely still, the way a face goes when the mind behind it is working very hard and does not have processing space left for expression. He looked at it for 40 seconds. Then he placed it back on the table carefully and looked at Admiral Vasquez for a long moment without speaking. When he finally spoke, his voice was even. "How long?" 30 years, she said, give or take. He nodded once, slowly, and said nothing more. He pushed the datapad toward Ambassador Keth Orvan. I did not see the contents of the datapad at that point. I was watching faces, which was my job. But I could tell from the reactions as the datapad moved around the table exactly what was on it. Ambassador Keth Orvan, who had begun the meeting with the air of someone who considered the whole exercise beneath him, became very still and then very carefully placed the datapad down and folded his hands on the table. High Cleric Orvan's expression went through 3 separate phases in about 10 seconds, ending somewhere between fury and a kind of reluctant respect. When the datapad finally reached me, I understood. It contained intelligence files. Comprehensive, detailed, cross-referenced intelligence files on all 4 warring empires, their military positions, their supply chains, their command hierarchies, the locations of their strategic reserves, the psychological profiles of their senior commanders, their known vulnerabilities, and their underutilized strengths. 30 years of observation, catalogued with a precision that was, frankly, better than anything in Chorath's own intelligence archive. Every fleet position, every supply route, every secret that each empire thought they had kept from the others. All 4 empires, completely mapped, completely understood. And at the bottom of the datapad, a single line that I read 3 times before its meaning settled into me fully. This information was gathered while maintaining a consistent, undetected presence in the Vorkai contested zone for 30 years. We chose not to act on it. We are choosing to share it instead. I sat back in my chair and looked at the human admiral, who was watching all of us with that expression I still did not have a word for, patient and present and entirely unafraid. They had been here for 30 years, in the middle of the most dangerous stretch of space in the known galaxy, watching, learning, undetected, and they had walked into this room not with a weapon or a demand, but with proof that they could have done anything they wanted and had chosen to do none of it. The room was very quiet for a long time. Then High Cleric Orvan said, in the precise and carrying voice of someone trained to address large congregations, "What do you want?" Admiral Vasquez leaned back slightly in her chair and folded her hands on the table in a way that mirrored, almost exactly, what Ambassador Keth Orvan had done. I do not think it was accidental. "Right now," she said, "nothing. This meeting is just an introduction." She stood, and her 2 escorts stood with her, and she nodded to each delegation in turn with that same expression, warm and entirely undramatic. "We'll be in touch," she said. And she left. The 4 of us sat in the room of an abandoned station in the middle of a 60-year war, staring at a datapad in the center of the table, and none of us spoke for a very long time. I wrote my report on the journey back. It was 37 pages. I have written longer reports, but I have never written one that I found harder to stop thinking about when I was finished. The last paragraph said, "This analyst recommends that all 4 empires pause current operations and devote significant resources to understanding what humanity is and what they want. The events of this meeting suggest that we have been sharing this region of space with a civilization we did not take seriously enough to study properly, and that this civilization has been studying us instead. The implications of this imbalance have not yet become clear. They will." Colonel Hanvor read the report and called me on a private channel. His voice, when he spoke, had a quality I had not heard from him in 11 years of working together. It was careful. "You believe all of this?" he asked. "Yes," I said. There was a pause. "The High Council will want to discuss options." "I understand," I said. "I would recommend discussing them quickly." He ended the call. I sat in my shuttle and watched the stars outside the viewport for a long time, thinking about that datapad and the single line at the bottom of it. 30 years, undetected, chose not to act, chose to share instead. I had spent my career understanding why species made the choices they made. I understood resource competition, territorial instinct, fear responses, dominance hierarchies, the whole complex machinery of how civilizations behaved when they encountered each other. I could usually look at a set of actions and trace them back to a set of motivations that made sense. I could not yet trace humanity's motivations back to anything I recognized. And that, more than anything else in that meeting, more than the intelligence files and the 30 years of undetected presence, and the smile that was not a performance, that was the thing that kept me awake. I did not understand them, and I was very good at understanding things. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks during which the contested zone continued its slow and grinding routine, which meant that people were still fighting and dying at the southern line. Supply convoys were still being intercepted, and the four empires were still moving their pieces across a board that had not changed meaningfully in 60 years. On the surface, nothing was different. Below the surface, everything had shifted. I could feel it in the communication traffic I was monitoring, the way the volume and the tone of messages between high commands had changed. Before the meeting, the intelligence communications between the four empires had been what they always were: hostile, guarded, full of misdirection. The Veth Collective's signal traffic with the Scaran theocracy had a particular quality to it, like two people who hated each other but were forced to share a small room and had developed elaborate rituals for managing the situation. The Mern Republic's communications were brisk and professional because General Fasik Dran ran a tight organization and did not tolerate waste. Chorath's own traffic, which I was of course most familiar with, had the characteristic heaviness of a bureaucracy that had been at war long enough to develop very detailed procedures for everything. After the meeting, all four sets of traffic developed a new quality. It was subtle. It would not have been obvious to anyone who was not looking for it specifically. But I was looking, because looking was my function, and what I noticed was this. Every high command in the contested zone had started allocating analytical resources to the same problem: the human ship, the intelligence files on the datapad, what it meant, what to do about it. They were all, in other words, doing what I was doing. They were trying to understand an entity they had no framework for. I filed 3 additional reports during those 3 weeks. Each one was longer than the last, and more uncertain in its conclusions. My supervisor, Colonel Hayan Vor, read each one, and responded with fewer words each time. I interpreted this as a sign that the people above him were paying close attention, and that he had been told to keep me focused on observation rather than speculation. This was a reasonable instruction. I was not following it perfectly. On the 19th day, something changed. The human ship moved. Not far. It repositioned from the outer edge of the northern quadrant to a position slightly deeper into the contested zone, which should have been impossible to do quietly, given the amount of sensor coverage in that area. The Veth Collective had sensor buoys in a network that should have caught any movement. The Scaran theocracy had a patrol route that covered the northern corridor. Neither of them picked it up. The human ship moved approximately 40,000 kilometers through actively monitored space and appeared in its new position without triggering a single alarm. When I noticed it in my own data, I sat very still for several seconds, and then went back through the sensor logs methodically, hour by hour, looking for the moment the ship had moved. I could not find it. The ship had simply been in one place, and then, later, was in another, and there was no record of the transition. I included this in my report, and noted that it raised significant questions about the capabilities of the vessel's propulsion and stealth systems. What I did not include in the report, because it was not an analytical observation, but a personal one, was the feeling that went through me when I realized what had happened. It was a feeling I had not experienced in a long time. It was the particular sensation of realizing that the situation you are trying to understand is significantly larger than the understanding you have built so far. On the 21st day, the Scaran theocracy made a decision. I found out about it indirectly, through the change in their patrol patterns, which told me that a senior command decision had been made, and that whatever it was, it involved moving assets toward the northern quadrant. I filed a warning report within the hour. I did not know exactly what they were planning, but the pattern of the movements was not consistent with any defensive operation I recognized. It was consistent with an intercept. The human ship had not moved again. It was sitting in its new position, doing nothing observable, broadcasting nothing, just present. I have thought, many times in the years since, about whether I could have prevented what happened next. I do not believe I could have. My report warning of the Scaran movement was filed and acknowledged, and the acknowledgement told me that High Command was aware and was monitoring the situation. What High Command did not do, and what I suspect no one in Chorath's command structure believed was necessary, was contact the Scaran theocracy and suggest they reconsider. Because for 60 years the relationship between the four empires had been competitive and hostile, and suggesting to the Scaran that they might be making a mistake was not something Chorath's High Council was culturally prepared to do. So I watched. 40 Scaran warships materialized around the human vessel over the course of 6 hours. It was carefully done, professionally executed, the kind of fleet positioning that spoke to experienced tactical commanders who knew their work. They came from multiple vectors, appearing one or two at a time rather than all at once, so that by the time the net was fully drawn, there was genuinely no obvious escape corridor. It was, by any objective military assessment, a well-executed encirclement. The human ship did not move. High Cleric Orvan's command vessel sent a broadcast on an open frequency. The broadcast was brief and direct. Leave this zone or be engaged. They gave a time limit of 2 hours. The human ship did not respond. I was watching everything. I had pulled every sensor feed I had access to, overlaid the tactical display, and was monitoring communications across 16 frequencies simultaneously. My night shift technician Dreven had come in early when he saw what was developing, and he was running additional analysis from his station without being asked. Neither of us spoke much. There was not much to say. At the 40-minute mark, the Scaran fleet reduced the gap between their ships and the human vessel. A warning shot, then another. They were energy discharges at about 30% standard power, close enough to the human ship to register clearly on any sensor system the vessel might have, not close enough to cause structural damage. The galactic military tradition for warning shots was well established across species, and the Scaran were following it precisely. The human ship responded. One broadcast, clear and measured, in standard galactic, on the same open frequency the Scaran had used. We have recorded this. You have one opportunity to stand down. That was all. High Cleric Orvan's fleet did not stand down. I had not expected them to. The Scaran theocracy's military doctrine, which I had studied extensively, treated retreating from a confrontation as a theological failure as well as a tactical one. They believed that showing strength was a form of religious devotion, that their god or gods, the theological specifics were genuinely complicated and contested even within the theocracy, approved of decisiveness and condemned hesitation. Walking away from a confrontation they had already initiated, in front of 40 warships worth of their own personnel, was not something the command structure of the Scaran theocracy was built to do. They opened fire. What happened next lasted 9 minutes by my clock, and I have reviewed the sensor data from those 9 minutes more times than I can count, and I still find something new in it almost every time. For the first 3 minutes, the human ship took everything the Scaran fleet sent at it. 40 warships firing at a single vessel, and the human ship held position and absorbed it. Its shields, whatever technology was behind them, were clearly operating, because the energy readings from the hull indicated the vessel itself was not yet taking direct damage. But the shield readings were fluctuating in ways that told me they were under serious stress. I was watching numbers climb toward thresholds I estimated the system could not sustain, and the human ship did not return fire. I wrote one line in my log during those 3 minutes. Absorbing damage deliberately. This is intentional. Because it was. I could not prove it, not from sensor data alone, but every analyst instinct I had developed over 30 years told me that a ship capable of moving undetected through active sensor coverage for 30 years, capable of repositioning 40,000 kilometers through a monitored corridor without triggering an alarm, was not simply failing to respond to incoming fire because it could not. It was choosing not to. It was making a point. At the 3-minute and 40-second mark, the shield readings crossed a threshold I had been watching, and something changed in the human vessel's power signature. Not a spike, not a surge, but a smooth, controlled shift in the direction of energy allocation, the kind of shift you see when a system has been running on reserve capacity and is bringing primary systems online. At the 4-minute mark, the human ship turned. Not fled. Turned. Oriented itself, in the middle of 40 warships, with the same precise unhurried quality as everything else I had observed this vessel do, and began to move. The first Scaran warship stopped functioning at the 4-minute and 20-second mark. Not destroyed. The vessel went dark. Power systems offline. Weapons offline. Propulsion offline. It simply stopped. The second went the same way 11 seconds later. The third at 15 seconds after that. I watched my display with a feeling I can only describe as vertigo, because I had seen space battles before, many of them, and I knew what they looked like. They looked like destruction, explosions, debris fields, hull breaches. They looked, in other words, like things being torn apart. This looked like things being turned off. In the first 40 seconds, 6 Scaran warships went dark. Not destroyed, not eliminated, just rendered inoperative, in a way that was neat and precise, and left the hulls intact. I was running analysis as fast as my systems would process, trying to understand the mechanism. The energy signatures suggested something I had never seen in a weapons system before. Highly targeted disruption of specific systems, rather than generalized destructive output. Whatever the human ship was firing with, it was not designed to destroy. It was designed to disable, and it was doing so with a level of targeting precision that was, technically, extraordinary. The Scaran fleet scattered. Not all at once. Military units do not rout all at once. Not professional ones. And the Scaran military was professional. They broke into subgroups and attempted tactical repositioning, which was the correct response to what was happening to them. Several ships turned their fire to maximum output, which again was the correct tactical response when your current approach was producing adverse results. It did not matter. The human ship moved through the Scaran formation with a quality that I can only describe, and I am aware that this is not an analyst's description, but it is the accurate one, as contemptuous precision. It was not hurrying. It was not desperate or reactive. It was methodical. Each movement was efficient. Each engagement was brief. Ship after ship in the Scaran fleet went dark, some in sequence, some simultaneously, and within 90 seconds of the human ship's first return engagement, the formation had been broken, and the fleet was no longer functioning as a coherent tactical unit. At the 5-minute and 50-second mark, the human ship broadcast again. Same open frequency, same measured tone. We said one opportunity, nothing more. The remaining Scaran ships that still had propulsion fled. All of them, at once, in different directions, because discipline breaks when an organized force realizes it is not in a fight it can win. The human ship did not pursue any of them. It returned to its previous position, stopped, and went still. 34 Scaran warships were drifting, dark and powerless but intact, their crews alive. 6 had been destroyed in the engagement, I noted, and this detail would appear in every report I wrote for the next 2 years, that the 6 destroyed ships were the ones that had maintained fire on the human vessel longest and at closest range. Ships that had not reduced their aggression, even after the outcome became clear. The 34 that went dark had been neutralized before they reached that threshold. I sat at my console for a long time after it was over, looking at the display, and then I did something I had not done at my workstation in 11 months. I stood up and walked to the viewport and looked at the actual stars rather than the sensor representation of them, because I needed a moment that was not mediated by data. Dreven came and stood beside me after a while. He was a young analyst, talented, much better with numbers than I was, and he had a habit of processing his thoughts out loud in a way that I found useful, because it often said clearly what I was only thinking. "The recording," he said. "Yes," I said. "They said they had recorded it." Before anything started. "Yes. So this was," he paused, choosing his word, "documented, from their side, before they responded." "That is what the statement implied," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "That is a very specific thing to say before a battle." "It is not a statement made for battle," I said. "It is a statement made for something that comes after a battle." He looked at me. He was young enough that he sometimes missed the second layer of what a statement meant, but he was also smart enough that when you pointed him at it, he found it quickly. "Evidence," he said. "Evidence," I agreed. I turned back to my console and began writing the report. It was the longest report I had filed in my career up to that point. 51 pages. The analysis section ran for 30 pages and covered what the human ship had done, how it had done it, based on what the sensor data allowed me to infer, and what the choice to disable, rather than destroy, suggested about the strategic intent of the vessel, and, by extension, the civilization behind it. The last page of the report was not an analysis section. It was a personal notation, which I was technically not supposed to include, but which I included anyway, because I believed it was more important than any of the technical data preceding it. I wrote, "This analyst has spent 31 years studying conflict between civilizations. In every conflict studied, the dominant strategic mode of all parties has been to demonstrate power through its use. Strength is shown by striking, by destroying, by overwhelming. This is true across every species in the catalog database, without exception, because it reflects the fundamental logic of predator behavior. You demonstrate what you can do by doing it. Today I watched a vessel sustain deliberate damage for approximately 4 minutes, rather than respond immediately to an armed engagement. This vessel, based on what it subsequently demonstrated, could have responded within seconds of the engagement opening, and would almost certainly have produced the same result. It did not. It waited. It absorbed. It recorded. It then responded with force, calibrated specifically to avoid destroying the majority of the ships engaging it, despite having both the opportunity and what any civilization would consider the justification to do so. The statement it broadcast before the engagement, and the statement it broadcast afterward, suggest that everything that happened was conducted with awareness that it would need to be justified, documented, and explained at some future point. The human ship fought, as if it expected to account for its actions to someone later. This is not the behavior of a species that fights to win. It is the behavior of a species that fights to be right. I am not certain, yet, what the practical difference is. I am increasingly certain that there is one, and that it is significant. Colonel Hanvor read that report in full. I know because he referenced specific passages from it when he contacted me the following day. His voice had that careful quality again. "The High Council has been briefed," he said. "There is discussion of whether to increase our presence in the northern quadrant." "I would recommend against that," I said, "for the reasons stated in the report." "The Council is aware of your reasons," he said. "They find them interesting, but inconclusive." "Then I would recommend they review the final page of the report again," I said. Specifically the line about documentation. There was a pause. "You believe the humans are building a case." "I believe," I said, "that they began building it before they arrived." Another pause. Longer this time. "For what purpose?" I looked at my display, at the dark shapes of 34 Scaran warships drifting in neutral space. Intact, their crews alive. A fleet rendered helpless, rather than destroyed by something that could have destroyed it. "I do not yet know," I said, "but I am beginning to think that the purpose is not military." He ended the call. I went back to my data. Outside the viewport, the contested zone went on being contested. But something had changed in it that I could feel even if I could not yet fully measure. The human ship was still out there, sitting still, waiting. For what? I was only beginning to guess. Chorath's High Council made its decision 4 days after the Scaran engagement, and the decision was to send me directly to the human vessel. Not to negotiate. They were very clear about that. I was not being sent with any offer, or any concession, or any kind of institutional position. I was being sent because the High Council, after reading my reports and running their own analysis, had concluded that the most useful thing Chorath could do at this particular moment was to understand the entity they were dealing with before anyone else did. Information, as Colonel Hanvor reminded me on the morning of my departure, was the only genuine advantage in a situation where military options were unclear. I was also, I understood without being told, being sent because I had developed something in my reports that the High Council considered either an asset or a liability depending on how things went. A perspective. I had opinions about what the humans were doing, and why they were doing it. Whether those opinions were correct was what I was going to find out. The shuttle journey to the human vessel took 3 hours. I traveled alone. I had considered bringing Dreven as an assistant, partly because he was useful and partly because I thought having another set of eyes would help, but ultimately decided against it. Something in my reading of Admiral Vasquez told me that the human approach to this kind of interaction valued directness, and arriving with a staff would read as defensive. I traveled alone, and I brought only my analysis equipment and the standard diplomatic identification package that every Choreth official carried. The human vessel grew larger in the shuttle's viewport as I approached, and the closer I got, the more details I could see that had not been visible from the observation platform's long-range sensors. The hull damage from the Scaran engagement was visible, patches where the energy weapons had finally gotten through the shields and scored the outer plating. But I also began to see older damage, much older, layered under the newer scoring in a way that told a long story. This ship had been in many engagements before this one. Some of the patches I could see were structural repairs rather than cosmetic ones, sections of hull that had been replaced entirely. One section near the aft of the vessel had a color difference subtle enough that I almost missed it, a slightly different shade of the same material, indicating that piece had been attached more recently than the rest. By my estimate, it was not recent by the standards of my own service. It was perhaps 15 years old. The section it had replaced had presumably been damaged or destroyed 15 years ago. And yet the ship was here, still flying, still functional. I found myself wondering, on that 3-hour journey, about the history of the vessel. Not its technical specifications, which were what most of my colleagues would have focused on, but its actual history, the battles it had been in, the decisions that had been made on it, the repairs it had received, and who had made them, and under what circumstances. A ship that old, that clearly experienced, carried its history in its hull the way a person carried scars, visible if you knew how to look. The docking approach was handled by an automated system that communicated with my shuttle in clear standard Galactic, guiding me through a sequence of approach vectors and speed reductions that was, I noted, more thorough and more professionally executed than most military docking protocols I had experienced. The human vessel was a working ship, and its crew ran it like one. The docking bay was large and busy. This was the first thing that struck me when my shuttle's door opened, how busy it was. I had expected some version of the formal reception I would have encountered on any equivalent Chorath vessel, which would have involved a receiving line, a brief ceremony, and a senior officer whose sole function for the duration of my arrival would be to make the institutional impression. What I found instead was a docking bay full of people actively doing things. 3 separate repair operations were underway. A group of 6 humans in working clothes were applying sealant to a section of interior wall that had been stressed by the engagement, moving with the efficiency of a team that had done this kind of work many times before. Another team was moving equipment on a repurposing track, mechanical components that I recognized as belonging to a shield emitter system, either replacing or upgrading something. A third group was having what appeared to be a vigorous disagreement about something on a tablet display, 2 of them pointing at different sections of a schematic, while a third shook her head repeatedly. None of them stopped what they were doing when I emerged from the shuttle. A few of them looked up. One of them, a young man with short red hair who was carrying what appeared to be a very heavy component, grinned at me, with what I can only describe as unself-conscious friendliness, and said, "You're the Chorath analyst, right? Admiral Vasquez is in the main corridor. Second junction left. Keep going until you see the maps room." He then continued carrying his heavy component, because he was on his way somewhere, and my arrival had not changed that. I stood in the docking bay for a moment, recalibrating. On any other warship of equivalent class that I had ever visited, my arrival would have been a matter of protocol and staging. The ship's culture would have organized itself around my presence, at least temporarily, because that is what military organizations did when they had a guest. They performed readiness, they demonstrated order, they showed you the version of themselves that they wanted you to see. This ship was showing me the version of itself that was actually there. I found the maps room without difficulty. It was not a formal meeting space, but a working one. A long room with display screens covering 3 of the 4 walls, physical charts overlapping each other on a central table, and 2 people sitting in chairs looking at something on a shared screen, who glanced up when I entered, nodded without apparent surprise, and returned to what they were doing. Admiral Vasquez was standing at the far end of the room with her back to me, looking at a display that showed a large-scale map of the contested zone. She turned when she heard me enter, and she had that expression again, the warm and unpracticed one, but with something additional in it now, a kind of alertness that had not been as visible in the formal setting of the neutral station. She was, I realized, genuinely interested in my presence here, not as a strategic variable, but as an event in itself. Vale Reth, she said. She pronounced the name correctly, which required a particular consonant combination that most non-Chorath found difficult. I was wondering when Chorath would send someone directly. Sit anywhere. There were several chairs in various positions around the room. None of them were arranged in any formal pattern, which meant there was no default hierarchy implied by their placement. I chose the chair closest to the main display because it gave me the best view of the room, a habit from years of observation work. "How do you know my name?" I asked. "Same way you know mine," she said. I paid attention at the meeting. She pulled a chair toward the table and sat down in it, the way someone sits when they are comfortable, not as a demonstration. "Your delegation included 6 files, and you were the only one who didn't bring a staff. That's either very confident or very practical. Your reports tend toward practical." I noticed the phrasing. "You have read my reports." "I've read everyone's reports," she said. "The ones filed with the respective high commands in the 48 hours after the initial meeting. The ones from after the Scaran engagement too." She paused. "Yours are the most accurate. The others have more institutional bias." There was a silence while I processed the fact that she had been reading intelligence reports filed with Chorath's high command. The implications of this were substantial, and I set them aside for later analysis, because the more immediately relevant question was what she intended me to do with this information. "You want me to know that you have access to our communications," I said. "I want you to understand what kind of situation you're in," she said. "Not as a threat, as context. You've been very good at reading context. I thought you deserved accurate information to work with." A human crew member entered without knocking, placed 2 containers of something warm on the edge of the table near us, and left without saying anything. Vasquez picked up one of the containers and wrapped both hands around it. There was something so unstudied about the gesture, the way a person holds something warm because it is comforting, that I found myself noting it in my mental file as another data point in the accumulating picture of what humanity was. "Why are you here?" I asked. Not the geopolitical version of the question. The direct one. She did not seem surprised by the directness. "The war," she said. "Not your war specifically. The regional instability it creates. The contested zone bleeds into transit corridors that we use, or want to use. Trade routes. Resource access points. The war has been making this entire region economically inaccessible for 60 years. And we've been patient, but at a certain point, patience requires action, or it becomes negligence." "You want the war to end," I said. "We want the region to be functional," she said. "The war ending is the most efficient path to that, but the mechanism matters. We're not interested in conquering anyone. We're not interested in controlling anyone. If we wanted to do that, we've had 30 years and a fairly clear understanding of everyone's weakest points." She said it without any particular emphasis, which was somehow more effective than if she had said it with emphasis. It was simply a statement of fact. They could have done this, they had not, and the decision had been deliberate. "Then what is the mechanism?" I asked. "That's what I want to show you," she said. She stood, and I followed her, and what came next was not a formal tour. It was something else entirely, something I did not have a precise word for at the time, and would spend considerable effort trying to describe in my subsequent reports. She walked me through her ship, the way someone who genuinely loves a place walks you through it, not performing pride, not conducting a demonstration, just moving through familiar spaces and noticing things as she went, pointing out what was interesting or relevant or worth attention. The medical bay first, not because she announced it as the first stop, but because it was on the way, and she paused at the door and said, "This might be useful context." The medical bay had 4 occupied recovery stations, 4 Chorath crew members, 2 Veth, and 1 Scaran, all being treated for injuries, not prisoners. The Scaran, who had been pulled from one of the dark ships after the engagement, was sitting up in her recovery station and talking to the human medical staff with the careful wariness of someone who was receiving good treatment from people she had expected to be her enemies. I stopped in the doorway. "These are from the engagement." "Some of them," Vasquez said. "The Chorath crew are from a supply ship that got caught in crossfire 4 months ago. We pulled them out before the Mern Republic patrol that was going to reach them first. They were brought here," I said. "They needed medical attention," she said. "We had the facility." It was that simple. It was that straightforward. I made a note of it. and followed her further into the ship. She showed me the engineering spaces, where the repair work I had seen from the docking bay was ongoing, and where the team working on the shield emitter system had made progress since my arrival. She showed me a small room off one of the main corridors that was used, she explained, as a communications archive. The place where everything the ship had recorded in 30 years of operating in the contested zone was stored and cross-referenced. The room was not dramatic. It was rows of storage units and a terminal, and 3 people cataloging data. But the sheer volume of what was stored there was visible in the scale of the room, and I did the mental calculation while standing in the doorway, and arrived at a number that made my next few steps slower than they should have been. 30 years of data. From this ship alone. There are more vessels, I said. It was not a question. There are more vessels, she confirmed. I had suspected it. The datapad at the meeting had contained more information than one ship's crew could have gathered alone, even over 30 years. The comprehensiveness of the files, the consistency of the coverage across all 4 empires, the way it had no gaps that corresponded to any period when a single ship would logically have been out of position, all of it pointed toward a coordinated effort involving multiple vessels. How many? I asked. Enough, she said. She was watching me with that alertness I had noticed when I arrived, the look of someone paying close attention, and I realized she was not just informing me about the situation. She was observing how I responded to information. She was, in other words, doing exactly what I was doing. We understood each other on that level, very quickly, I think. She brought me finally to a room that was smaller than the others, a working space, rather than a functional one, with a single display screen and 2 chairs. On the display screen was a document, not a military file, not a tactical assessment, a document with numbered sections and subsections, dense with text, cross-referenced with data appendices. What is this? I asked, though I had a hypothesis forming already.
Spooshing.
Read the title, she said. I read it. I sat down without being invited to and read it again. The title was, A Framework for Resolution of the Vorkai Territorial Conflict, Comprehensive Analysis and Proposed Settlement. Below the title, a date. The document had been drafted 8 years ago. I looked at her. She looked back at me, with that expression that was not a performance. And in the silence of that small room on a human warship in the middle of a 60-year war, I understood something that I had been building toward without fully arriving at for 3 weeks. You came here with the ending already written, I said. We came here with a proposal, she said. Whether it's an ending depends on whether anyone is willing to read it. I reached out and scrolled through the document. It was thorough, in a way that was almost shocking. Not because the content was beyond anything I could have imagined. Some of the proposals were predictable enough: resource sharing agreements, territorial adjustments, neutral administration of certain strategically sensitive areas, all things that experienced diplomats would have eventually arrived at. What was shocking was the depth of the analysis behind each proposal. Every section had appendices. Every appendix had data. The data was sourced from 30 years of observation that included economic modeling I had not seen anywhere in the Galactic database, demographic analysis that went significantly beyond anything any of the 4 empires had produced for their own populations, and a timeline of implementation that accounted for a remarkable range of variables. It was not a draft. It had the quality of something that had been refined over years by people who took it seriously. There were revision markers in the metadata. The earliest draft was 11 years old. They had been writing this for 11 years. While the war continued and people died for territory that this document proposed to reallocate through negotiation, they had been in this ship and others like it, observing and analyzing and drafting and revising, building a solution. Why not present this at the meeting? I asked. Because you wouldn't have read it, she said. You were all too busy figuring out whether we were a threat. You needed time to answer that question before you could ask a different one. And the engagement with the Skaran, I said. She was quiet for a moment, not evasive, just thinking about how to answer precisely. The Skaran engagement provided documentation, she said. It put on record, clearly and with witnesses from every monitoring station in the zone, that we were engaged first and responded with proportionate force. It also demonstrated our capability in a way that the datapad alone could not. People understand data abstractly. They understand what they have seen with their own sensors differently. She paused. And it gave the Skaran command something to explain to their own people. It is easier to move toward peace when you can tell your population that you tested the alternative and found it insufficient. I sat with that for a long time. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the ship's systems, the low background hum of a vessel running at low operational tempo, the distant sound of the repair team in the engineering corridor. You allowed them to attack you, I said. We allowed the situation to develop to its natural conclusion, she said carefully. We did not fire first. We did not fire more than the situation required. Everything that happened is on record. For whom? I asked. For the next step, she said. I looked at the document on the display screen. A framework for resolution, 11 years of drafting, 30 years of data behind it. You need all 4 empires at a table, I said. We need all 4 empires to be ready for a table, she said. There's a difference. People who come to a negotiation because they have no better option are different from people who come because they have looked at every option and chosen this one. And the demonstration, I said, of what your ships can do is part of making the other options less appealing. The demonstration, she said, is part of making the honest calculation possible. She leaned forward slightly in her chair. We're not threatening anyone. We are providing information. Accurate, complete information about the situation as it actually exists. What everyone does with that information is their own choice. I looked at her for a long moment. 31 years of reading people. I had sat across from warlords who claimed to want peace while planning their next offensive. I had interviewed diplomats whose every word was a layer of concealment over a different word. I had learned to read the texture of dishonesty in the same way a doctor learns to read the signs of illness, by the things that are slightly not right, the small inconsistencies that accumulate into a pattern. I could not find those things in Admiral Vasquez. This did not prove she was entirely transparent, but it told me something. I picked up the container of warm liquid that the crew member had left for me, held it the way she had held hers, and read the beginning of the document again. I will need a copy, I said. You'll have one before your shuttle leaves, she said. I already had it prepared. Of course she had. The document I brought back changed things in ways I had not predicted, and I had predicted quite a lot. I had expected High Command to read it and see a diplomatic framework. I had expected them to analyze it carefully, identify the sections that benefited Chorath and the sections that required concessions, and begin the slow institutional process of deciding how to respond. This is what Chorath's diplomatic apparatus did with documents. It was methodical and thorough, and took a great deal of time. What actually happened was that Colonel Han Vor read the first 50 pages in a single sitting, called me at 0200 in the morning, and asked me 3 questions in a row, without waiting for answers between them. Who else has this? How long have they had it? Does this document have an expiration date? I answered in order. I do not know who else has it, though I assume everyone will within days given what I observed of the human intelligence operation. They have been working on it for at least 11 years, based on the revision metadata, and I do not know about an expiration date, but that is a question I should have asked and did not. There was a pause. You did not ask if there was a deadline. I was processing other information at the time, I said. I believe the question was implied. Vale Reth, he said, and his voice had the tone of a man who was trying to hold several alarming things in his mind simultaneously. If the Mern Republic reads this document before we do anything with it, they will move on at least 4 of these proposals immediately. And if they move first, the framework shifts in their favor at every point where it currently has a negotiable range. This was correct. I had already identified the same thing in my own analysis. The document was fair, genuinely fair, in a way that was almost architecturally sophisticated, but fair does not mean identical for all parties. There were sections where the proposal favored whatever party engaged with it earliest, because the settlement values in those sections were calibrated to the current state of the conflict rather than a fixed historical point. If the conflict state changed, the values changed. If one empire moved to negotiate before others, they would be negotiating from the current position, which was, for the Korath Dominion, not unfavorable. I am aware, I said. What do you recommend? I had been thinking about this since I left the human vessel. I had been thinking about it the entire shuttle ride back, and I had been thinking about it during the 4 hours I had spent writing my preliminary report before Han Vor called me. The answer was not difficult to arrive at. The difficulty was in committing to it. I recommend that Chorath contact Admiral Vasquez directly and express provisional interest in the framework, I said. Not commitment. Provisional interest. Enough to open a dedicated communication channel and begin the process of formal engagement. And if the others move before we do, then we will need to move faster, I said. But the alternative is waiting and hoping that our position improves, and I do not see a mechanism by which it improves if we wait. He was quiet for a long moment. I could hear him breathing, which was unusual. HFY was the kind of person who managed his presence on a communication channel the way he managed everything else, with deliberate control. The fact that I could hear him breathing meant he was thinking hard enough that the control had slipped slightly. The High Council will need to convene, he said. I understand, I said. I would suggest convening quickly. He ended the call. I sat in my quarters on the observation platform and waited. The waiting was the worst part of my job, the gap between the moment when an analyst understood what needed to happen and the moment when the institutions that employed the analyst caught up. The Mern Republic caught up first. Not to the document, which I believe they also received within 48 hours of my visit, but to the situation. General Fasik Dran, who was not a diplomat but was an exceptionally good strategic thinker, apparently made the same calculation that Han Vor had made within hours of receiving the framework. He did not wait for his council to convene. He sent a direct communication to the human vessel, requesting a working session with Admiral Vasquez. I found out about this, as I found out about most things, through the change in communication patterns. Mern's signal traffic to the northern quadrant increased, specifically in the human vessel's direction, in a way that was unmistakable to anyone watching it carefully. I filed an urgent advisory report and then did something I had not done in my career. I included, at the bottom of the advisory, a personal recommendation that was more direct than anything I had previously put in an official document. I wrote, "The window for Chorath to engage with this process, on favorable terms, is narrowing. I recommend that the High Council authorize direct engagement within 72 hours, or accept that our position in any eventual settlement will reflect our lateness to the process, rather than our actual interests." Han Vor called me within an hour. His voice was tight but controlled. "The High Council," he said, "has authorized preliminary contact." "Good," I said. "You will be conducting the preliminary contact," he said. This was not a surprise. "I understand. There is an additional development," he said, and his voice changed in a way that told me the next piece of information was something he found genuinely uncomfortable. "The Veth Collective has filed a formal objection with the neutral station protocols." I processed this. On what grounds? They have submitted documentation claiming that the Scaran engagement was not a legitimate defensive action by the human vessel, but rather an unprovoked offensive operation that constitutes a violation of contested zone protocols. I sat with this for several seconds. "That is incorrect," I said. "The sensor data clearly shows the engagement order and sequence." "It is incorrect," he agreed. "The Veth Collective's intelligence team knows it is incorrect. The formal objection is not about the facts. It is about the process. If the objection is entered into the neutral record, it creates a procedural complication for any subsequent formal engagement that involves the contested zone protocols." "They want to slow things down," I said. "They want to be in the room for the conversation before the conversation happens," he said. "The formal objection is leverage. If they can require a formal response to the objection, they buy themselves time and a seat at the table they have not yet earned." I thought about this. Then I thought about Admiral Vasquez and the way she had described the events in the North Quadrant. We provided accurate information about the situation as it actually exists. And then the things she had said about documentation, about making things legible for the record, came back to me with new clarity. "The objection will not hold," I said. "Not if the human ship's recordings are entered into the neutral record as well. The human ship's recordings would need to be submitted by someone with standing at the neutral station," Han Vor said. "Then Chorath should submit them," I said. "We have standing. We have had an observer present in the zone for the relevant period. We request that the human vessel provide its recordings to Chorath's delegation, and we enter them into the neutral record." There was a pause long enough that I could count to 7. "This would put Chorath publicly on record as engaged with the human position, Before we have formally agreed to engage, he said. Yes, I said. But it would also put Chorath on record as a party that acts on accurate information and upholds process integrity. That is a position worth having when a settlement framework is being drafted. Another pause. You have thought about this carefully. I have been thinking about very little else, I said. The authorization came through in 4 hours. I contacted the human vessel on the direct channel that Vasquez had provided me before I left and made the request. Her response came back in 40 minutes, which was faster than I expected. The recordings would be transferred to Chorath's secure communication system and prepared for submission to the neutral station. What came with the recordings was something I had not requested and had not expected. In addition to the full sensor and audio record of the Scaran engagement, the human vessel sent a supplementary file. It was labeled simply, Additional Context. I opened it. The additional context was a complete record of every interaction the human vessel had conducted in the contested zone over the past 30 years that involved any of the 4 warring empires. Not the intelligence files from the meeting datapad, those were strategic records. These were operational records, specific events, ships rescued, crew members treated, emergency repairs provided to vessels from all 4 empires, fuel transfers, navigation assistance in debris fields, medical supply drops to stations that were running low. 30 years of small, quiet, unremarked acts of assistance, distributed across all 4 parties to the conflict, without favor or distinction. The records were meticulous. Every event had a date, a vessel identification, a crew count, a nature of assistance, an outcome. The human ship had kept a log of every person they had helped, not as a bureaucratic function, but in the detailed way of someone who understood that these records would matter eventually. I read through the file for 2 hours. When I was finished, I sat back in my chair and thought about the document on the display in the small room on the human vessel, the peace framework with its 11 years of drafts and revisions, and I thought about what it meant that they had been helping people for 30 years at the same time they had been preparing that document. They had not come to the contested zone as observers. They had come as participants in a different kind of way. Not participants in the war, participants in the reality that the war created, the damaged ships and wounded crews, and supply shortages, and emergency situations that the war produced as its constant byproduct. They had spent 30 years in this zone helping everyone, impartially, without announcing it, without asking for anything in return, without even making it known that they were doing it. The people they had helped had presumably known. But there had been no broadcast, no diplomatic announcement, no records submitted to any neutral body. They had simply done it and kept the records themselves. And now, they were making those records available. I read the file again. Then I drafted an addition to the submission I was preparing for the neutral station. The Veth Collective's formal objection challenged the legitimacy of the human vessel's presence in the zone and the nature of its actions. The supplementary file provided documentation of what that presence had actually consisted of. I submitted everything together, the recordings of the Scaran engagement and the 30 years of assistance records, as a unified response to the objection. I included a brief analytical note explaining the relationship between the 2 sets of records and their relevance to the question of the human vessel's nature and intent. The submission went into the neutral station's formal record at 1807 Standard Time. By 2100, I had received an indirect indicator that the Veth Collective had seen it. Their communication traffic to the northern quadrant changed pattern in a way that told me someone senior had reviewed the submission and had a strong reaction to it. By 0130 the following morning, Ambassador Kethorvan had withdrawn the formal objection. I wrote 2 lines in my personal log that night, which I kept separate from my official reports, because official reports required a standard of certainty I did not always have. The first line was, "The humans have been building this case not for weeks but for decades." The second line was, "The question is no longer whether the 4 empires will engage with the framework. The question is, whether they will understand what they are engaging with before they sign something they do not fully read." I did not sleep much that night. I was thinking about the document and the records and the 30 years of assistance and the 11 years of drafting, and the way Admiral Vasquez had said, "We're not interested in controlling anyone," with the flat confidence of someone who genuinely meant it. And I was thinking about a line in my xenobiology notes, from the very beginning of this whole sequence, when the database entry had said, Predator Origin Species, and I had filed it under, Interesting but not yet interpretable. I was beginning to interpret it. The thing about a predator, the defining characteristic, is not aggression. Aggression is common. Aggression is what you see in every species that has ever competed for resources, which is all of them. The defining characteristic of a true predator, the quality that separates a species that occasionally hunts from one that is fundamentally built around the hunt, is patience. The willingness to wait, the willingness to absorb discomfort and uncertainty, and observation, without acting until the moment, is exactly right. The human vessel had been in the contested zone for 30 years. It had been watching, helping, recording, waiting. It had allowed itself to be attacked before responding. It had built a peace framework over 11 years without telling anyone about it. All of this was patience. All of this was the behavior of something that understood, at a level deeper than strategy or policy, that the best time to act is when you have done all the preparation that makes the action matter. I thought about the Scaran engagement and the way the human ship had absorbed fire for nearly 4 minutes before responding. I had written that it was demonstrating something, making a point, establishing a record. I still believed all of that. But I began to understand that it was also something simpler and, in a way, more elemental. It was an organism that was comfortable being hit, comfortable absorbing damage, because it had an internal certainty that the damage was not the end of the situation. It could absorb because it knew what came after. Most species, when struck, react. Fight or flight, escalation or retreat, the immediate response to immediate threat. This is biology, deep and old. The human ship had been struck and had not reacted. It had continued on the course it had already chosen, as if the 40 Scaran warships were a weather event to be endured, rather than an attack to be answered. What kind of species develops that capacity? What depth of confidence, or what depth of experience, produces an organism that can be struck and think, not yet? I did not have a complete answer, but I was building toward one. The next scheduled meeting at the neutral station was in 12 days. All 4 Empire delegations had confirmed attendance, though the Veth Collective's confirmation had come with a notable delay and, reading the communication, a notable absence of their usual diplomatic framing. They were coming because they could not afford not to. The humans had not forced them. They had simply made the alternative to coming something no careful strategic mind would choose. 12 days. I had 12 days to understand as much as I could before the next piece of this situation moved into its next phase. I went back to the 30-year assistance records and began cross-referencing them with the intelligence files from the meeting datapad. I was looking for something specific, the relationship between the people the human vessel had helped and the positions they now held within their respective empires. Because 30 years was a long time, and people who had been rescued from damaged ships or treated in a foreign medical bay at the worst moments of their careers did not forget that. The cross-reference took 6 hours to run properly. When it finished, I sat and looked at the results for a very long time. 41 individuals in the assistance records held significant positions within the 4 empires. Not all of them were senior. Not all of them were in roles that would directly affect the peace process. But enough of them were in enough of the right places that I could see the shape of what 30 years of impartial assistance produced in an organizational landscape. It produced, quietly and without announcement, people who owed the human vessel nothing formal and everything personal. People who had been at their worst and had been helped without condition. People who would not necessarily advocate for the human position, but who would not, when the time came for important decisions, find it entirely comfortable to work against it. This was not manipulation. I want to be precise about that, because the distinction matters enormously. They had not helped those 41 individuals because of who they would become. They had no way to know, 30 years ago, who would rise to what position. They had helped them because they were people who needed help. The fact that those people subsequently rose in their organizations and now occupied positions of significance was not something the humans had engineered. It was simply something they had not wasted. I added this to my notes and labeled the section, Long Horizon Thinking in Social Systems. Then I sat back and thought about the fact that I was an analyst employed by one of the 4 warring empires to understand and defend Choreth's interests. now writing notes that read less like strategic analysis and more like a study in what it looked like when a civilization operated at a scale of intention that exceeded anything I had previously encountered in the galaxy. 12 days. I had a lot of reading still to do. The combined fleet was assembled in secret, which is to say that it was assembled the way all secrets are assembled, in a contested zone where 4 empires each maintain comprehensive sensor networks. Everyone knew it was happening, and everyone was pretending they did not. I became aware of it on the 8th day before the scheduled second summit, through the particular signature of heavy military assets, repositioning in ways that defied any standard tactical explanation. A Veth collective carrier group changed its patrol pattern and moved northeast, which put it significantly closer to the northern quadrant, while remaining technically within Veth-controlled space. 2 Mern Republic heavy cruisers, detached from their assigned convoy escort duties, without any documented operational reason. A Scaran warship cluster, which had been sitting at a repair station for 6 weeks following the engagement with the human vessel, was cleared for operations 4 days ahead of the scheduled completion of their repairs. And Chorath. Chorath's High Council, despite having authorized preliminary contact with Admiral Vasquez, and despite having submitted the neutral station documentation on Chorath's behalf, had also quietly moved a strike group into a holding position, 12 hours out from the northern quadrant. I found out about the Chorath strike group from Hanvor, who told me in a tone of professional neutrality that made clear he had either argued against this decision or at least not argued strongly enough for it. The High Council wants options, he said. Having options and deploying them are different things, I said. The Council is aware of the distinction, he said. Colonel, I said, which was the way I began conversations where I needed him to understand that I was speaking with more directness than normal. The second summit is in 8 days. We have submitted documentation to the neutral station that publicly aligns Chorath with process integrity. We have an active communication channel with the human delegation. If the High Council uses those 8 days to position military assets for a potential strike on the human vessel, and if that positioning is detected, the question of what we submitted to the neutral station and why becomes a much more interesting conversation. I agree with your analysis, he said. Then I would appreciate knowing what I can tell Admiral Vasquez, I said, because she will know about the repositioning. She has known about ours before we implemented it on every previous occasion. I would prefer not to discover what she says when she addresses it directly, rather than having answered it first. Hyanvor was quiet for long enough that I could hear the ventilation system in his office. I will communicate your concerns, he said. Thank you, I said. The communication ended. The Chorath strike group did not move, but it also did not stand down. I filed a report, and then did something that I had not been formally authorized to do, and did not ask authorization for, because in my experience, asking authorization for things in uncertain situations produces delays that are more costly than the risk of acting without it. I contacted the human vessel's direct channel and requested a brief working communication with Admiral Vasquez. She responded in 11 minutes. The repositioning, I said, when we were connected. All 4 empires, you know. We know, she said. I want you to understand that Chorath's participation in the repositioning is a high command decision that does not reflect the position of this delegation, I said. I know that too, she said. Vale Reth, I'm not surprised by any of this. When you show something its own limitations, the first response is almost always to look for a way around the limitation, rather than accept it. What are you going to do? I asked. Continue with the summit, she said. If the combined fleet moves on your vessel, then we'll respond appropriately, she said. We've thought about this scenario. The way she said it, flat and without drama, told me that they had not just thought about the scenario in the abstract way that militaries think about scenarios, categorizing and filing them, but had thought about it in the specific way that people think about things they expect to happen. They had anticipated it. They had prepared for it. How many ships? I asked. I had an estimate based on the repositioning data, but I wanted to hear what she would say. Based on current positioning? She was quiet for a second. We're counting 212, plus or minus a few I'm not certain about. My own estimate had been 209. The 3 ships I had not identified were presumably positioned in a way that made them harder to read from the sensor platforms I had access to. Against how many of yours? I said. There was a pause. Not because she was calculating. I believe the pause was because she was deciding how much to tell me. Enough, she said, which was the same answer she had given me about the number of human vessels in the zone when I had asked during my visit. It was clearly the answer she gave, when the honest answer was more than she wanted to commit to, in a way that might be recorded. That is not a number, I said. No, she agreed. It isn't. Veilreth, you're asking me to tell you our force capacity, because you want to know whether we can survive what's being positioned against us. I understand why you're asking. I'm not going to tell you, because that information is something I need to protect. What I will tell you is that this scenario is one we're prepared for, and that our response will follow the same principles as the Scaran engagement. Disable rather than destroy. Record everything. Respond proportionately. Leave an opening. The combined fleet is 212 ships, I said. The Scaran engagement involved 40. I know, she said. We'll be fine. She said it in the tone of someone who says things they mean, and I had been listening to Admiral Vasquez long enough to trust that quality in her. I was not certain "we'll be fine" was accurate. I was certain she believed it. I ended the communication and went back to watching sensor data. The combined fleet moved on the 11th day, after the repositioning began. Not 212 ships all at once, because a force that size moving all at once produces a sensor signature that every monitoring station in the zone would track in real time, and the political implications of that were apparently something the four empires had considered enough to adopt a staged approach. They came from 4 different directions, at different intervals, with the apparent intention of arriving at the human vessel's position at roughly the same time. It was, tactically, well organized. I had to give the coordinating intelligence that credit. Organizing 4 militaries that had been at war with each other for 60 years into a coherent approach pattern required significant trust-building measures and operational coordination that would normally have taken months to establish. They had done it in 11 days. The threat of something that all 4 empires found equally alarming, it turned out, was a remarkably effective accelerant for cooperation. The human vessel, and the 6 additional ships that had appeared during the Scaran engagement, and then repositioned to various locations in the zone, began to move before the combined fleet reached them. Not away, toward. I want to be precise about this, because it is the detail that, even now, years later, produces in me a reaction I cannot fully categorize. The 7 human vessels moved toward the incoming combined fleet. Not in an aggressive spread formation, not in a defensive cluster, but in what I can only describe as a working formation, the way a professional team deploys when it has a task to accomplish, and everyone knows their role. Efficient, deliberate, no wasted movement. The combined fleet's forward sensors would have detected this. The commanding officers of those 212 ships would have watched 7 vessels move to meet their formation, and would have done the same calculation that every person monitoring the situation was doing at that moment. 7 against 212. The human ship broadcast as the distance closed. The same open frequency as before. The same measured voice, which I had come to understand was Admiral Vasquez herself on the channel rather than a communications officer. We are aware of your approach. We have recorded the assembly and staging of this force over the past 11 days. We are transmitting that record to the neutral station now. We are also transmitting it to the full range of independent monitoring stations within signal range of this zone. We invite you to stand down. We will not issue this invitation more than once. The transmission included, attached as an addendum, the full sensor record of the fleet assembly that the human vessels had compiled over 11 days. Every repositioning, every staging movement, every communication relay between the 4 Empire high commands that their monitoring had captured. All of it. The complete record of how 212 ships had been organized against them, submitted in real time to the neutral record. The combined fleet did not stand down. It engaged. What happened over the next 11 hours I have described in formal reports, in briefings, in classified documents that will be sealed for the next 100 years. I have described it technically and analytically, and with the precision that my training requires. I will describe it here the way I actually experienced it, sitting at my sensor console, watching my displays, with Dreven beside me who had come in without being asked, because he understood, as I did, that this was the moment everything had been building toward, and neither of us was going to watch it from anywhere but the best available vantage. The first 40 minutes of the engagement were the hardest to watch. The 7 human vessels were outnumbered by a factor of 30 to 1, and in those first 40 minutes it showed. They took significant damage. Shields failing in sequences that my sensor equipment captured in granular detail. Hull readings that told me the outer plating was absorbing and then transmitting energy in ways that would eventually compromise structural integrity if sustained. 3 of the 7 ships were visibly struggling by the 45-minute mark, their movement becoming less fluid, their positioning less precise. Dreven said quietly, "At the 46-minute mark, I think we were wrong about them." I did not respond. I was watching too carefully. At the 47-minute mark, something changed. I have spent years since that day trying to understand exactly what changed and why it changed at that moment. The best analysis I can produce is this. The 7 human vessels were operating in a mode of constrained response for the first 47 minutes of the engagement. They were returning fire, but in a way that was controlled below their actual capacity. The damage they were absorbing was real, and the tactical pressure was genuinely significant, but something in the targeting and power allocation of the human vessels was held below its maximum during that period. At the 47-minute mark, they stopped constraining it. It was not a dramatic visual change. There was no obvious signal, no flash or surge that I could point to and say, "There, that is when it happened." The change was in the data. Power allocation curves on the human vessels shifted. Targeting intervals shortened. The movement pattern of the formation became more complex, operating in 3 dimensions simultaneously, in ways that my tactical display struggled to represent accurately, because it was designed for 2-dimensional engagement modeling. And ships in the combined fleet began to go dark. Not the way the Scarran ships had gone dark, one, and then another in a pace that felt deliberate and almost gentle. These went dark in clusters, in sequences that had a rhythm to them, like something being worked through methodically, systematically, with a kind of focused efficiency that produced in me, as I watched it, a feeling that I associate with watching a craftsperson do something they are very good at. Not brutal, not spectacular, competent, in a way that was somehow more unsettling than spectacle would have been. By the 2-hour mark, 61 ships of the combined fleet had been destroyed. Not disabled, destroyed. These were the vessels that had concentrated fire on the human ships during the first 47 minutes, the ones that had pushed hardest, gotten closest, refused to reduce their engagement, even as the pattern of the situation shifted around them. The human vessels had responded to maximum threat with maximum response. The remaining 150 ships were disabled over the course of the next 9 hours. I watched every minute of it. Dreven stayed at his station the entire time. We did not talk much. There was not much to say that the data was not already saying more clearly. The pattern was consistent throughout. Any ship that reduced its fire was disabled rather than destroyed. Any ship that continued at maximum engagement until it was too damaged to continue was destroyed. It was a constant, real-time offer being made across the entire engagement. Stop pressing, and you will survive this. 49 ships took the offer before they were destroyed. The mathematics of that were not comfortable. At the end of 11 hours, 31 ships had escaped. The human vessels had allowed them to. The sensor record was clear. 2 of the human ships had been in positions that would have intercepted the retreat, and had moved out of those positions before the escaping fleet reached them. The exit corridor had been opened deliberately. The combined fleet was gone. 2 ships remained on the field. Human vessels, both of them, stationary and clearly damaged, but present, both still powered, both still transmitting. The broadcast came on the same open frequency, at the end of the engagement, before anything else had been said by anyone. All disabled vessels, this is Admiral Vasquez. We are transmitting rescue coordinates for crew extraction. We will remain in position for 6 hours to allow recovery operations. Medical assistance is available on request. Dreven made a sound beside me that was not quite a word. The rescue coordinates they transmitted were positions where the disabled ships could be reached by their own Empire's recovery vessels without entering each other's territorial spaces. They had mapped the geometry of the recovery in advance. Whoever had worked out those coordinates had done so before the battle, not after, because working them out after would not have allowed them to be accurate for the actual positions of the disabled ships, which of course no one could have known in advance. Except that someone had known, or at least had produced a model accurate enough that the coordinates worked, because they did work. I watched the recovery operations unfold over the next 6 hours, and the coordinates were correct. They had planned the recovery before they fought the battle. I filed my report and then sat in my chair for a long time without filing anything else. The report was technical and precise, and covered everything that could be covered with sensor data and analytical inference. It did not cover the thing I kept coming back to as I sat there. I kept coming back to Dreven's comment at the 46-minute mark, when he had thought the 7 vessels were losing. I think we were wrong about them. He had meant that we had underestimated their military capacity. He was right about that. But what I sat with, in the long quiet after the engagement, was the understanding that we had been wrong about something deeper. We had been wrong about what they were doing in the contested zone. We had thought it was a demonstration of power. We had been right about that, but only partly. It was also, simultaneously and with no contradiction, a rescue operation, a documentation process, a negotiation tactic, and the final move in a sequence that had been designed to produce a specific outcome. 212 ships against 7. The 4 empires had assembled everything they could coordinate in 11 days. And the 7 human vessels had absorbed it, responded to it, and at the end of 11 hours had broadcast rescue coordinates. They had not won the battle. That was the wrong frame entirely. They had completed it. The way a process is completed when all its steps have been carried out, and the intended result has been produced. The second summit was still scheduled in 3 days. Nobody canceled it. The journey to the neutral station 3 days after the engagement was the quietest shuttle trip I have ever taken. I was not alone this time. Chorath's High Council had sent 3 additional representatives, a senior diplomat named Owen Fress who had been handling contested zone negotiations for 20 years, a military observer named Captain Dara Yin, whose job was to sit quietly and assess things, and a young legal specialist named Elliot Kahn, who was very good at reading documents and identifying the exact words that would bind one party to things they had not intended to agree to. They were competent people. They sat in their seats during the journey and reviewed their briefing materials and, when any of them caught my eye, looked away slightly faster than comfortable conversation would have required. They were afraid. Not of what was waiting at the neutral station. They were afraid in the particular way that people are afraid when the world has rearranged itself around them, and they have not yet found their footing in the new arrangement. 3 days ago, the Chorath High Council had participated in assembling the largest combined military fleet in the history of the contested zone. That fleet had been destroyed by 7 ships. The people sitting in this shuttle had been part of the decision-making structure that produced that outcome, and they were now traveling to a meeting with the representative of those 7 ships, and they were processing what that meant. I had been processing it for 3 days. I was still not done processing it, but I had processed enough to be functional. They had not had my 3 days of preparation. The neutral station had been cleaned since my first visit. Not just maintained, but genuinely prepared. The life support systems were running at full capacity. The meeting room had been arranged with more chairs than last time, additional space for the larger delegations everyone had apparently anticipated. There were water containers at every seat. Human crew members had come ahead to prepare the space, and they had done it with the same unstudied thoroughness I had seen in everything they did. Admiral Vasquez arrived after all 4 Empire delegations were seated. She looked the same. This sounds like an unremarkable observation, but I want to be precise about it. She looked exactly the same uniform, the same expression. After a battle that had lasted 11 hours and involved 7 ships against 212, after sustaining significant damage to multiple vessels and losing crew members, after completing what was objectively the most consequential military engagement in the history of this region of space, she walked into the neutral station meeting room, looking like a person who had done a day's work. Her 2 escorts were the same people as before. I recognized them. One of them had a new bandage on his left forearm, visible just below his sleeve. That was the only visible mark of the previous 3 days. Vasquez sat down, placed a datapad at the center of the table, and looked at all 4 delegations in turn. Nobody spoke. She let the silence run for perhaps 10 seconds. Then she said, "Thank you for coming. I know there were things that happened this week that are difficult to process. I want to acknowledge that before anything else. We don't take what happened lightly." Ambassador Kethorvan, who had withdrawn his formal objection 2 weeks earlier, and was now sitting in the meeting with the careful expression of a man who had made several miscalculations and was working very hard not to make another one, said, "You sustained significant damage." "We did," she said. "And casualties?" "Some," she said. She did not elaborate, and no one pressed her, because the way she said "some" made clear it was not a number she was going to share, and also that it was not a small number. Whatever the human vessel and its companions had absorbed in 11 hours had cost them real things. She was not performing toughness about it. She was simply not performing anything, as usual. General Fasik Dran, who had approved Mern Republic participation in the combined fleet, and who I suspected had had a worse 3 days than anyone else in the room, based on what I knew of his character, said, "The rescue coordinates." "Yes," she said. "You provided rescue coordinates for our disabled ships," he said, very carefully, as if he was placing each word deliberately. "During the battle, before it was over." "Yes," she said. "Those coordinates were accurate." "Yes." He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up at her. "Those coordinates were prepared before the battle started." "They were prepared before we expected a battle might start," she said. "When we became aware that a large fleet was assembling, we began planning for multiple outcomes, including ones where we needed to ensure that the crews of disabled vessels could be safely recovered. We hoped we wouldn't need them." A silence settled over the room that was different from the previous silences I had experienced in Vasquez's presence. The previous silences had contained confusion, or calculation, or the careful management of powerful people's egos. This silence contained something that took me a moment to identify, because it was not a quality I associated with high-level military and diplomatic meetings. It contained the particular quality of people who had expected contempt and received care instead, and who were not sure how to respond to the discrepancy. High Cleric Orvan, who had said almost nothing since we sat down, said, in a much quieter voice than his usual register, "How many of our crew did you recover?" Vasquez answered without checking any notes. She had the numbers ready. She gave them by empire, by ship designation, and by the nature of assistance provided during the recovery window. The breakdown took 4 minutes. When she was done, there was another silence. "You know all of these by memory?" Keth Orvan asked. "I reviewed them this morning," she said. "I wanted to be accurate." She had reviewed them. She had not memorized them by accident, or because she had a remarkable recall. She had prepared specifically to answer that question, because she had known it would be asked, and when it was asked, she had wanted to give an accurate answer, rather than a rounded one. Owen Fress, Chorith's senior diplomat who had been entirely silent since we arrived, said something I had not expected from him. "Why?" Vasquez looked at him. "Why recover our crew?" he said. "Why provide rescue coordinates? Why disable ships rather than destroy them, in most cases? You were attacked by a force more than 30 times your size. You would have had justification, by any military standard in the galaxy, to respond with maximum force and accept any losses on our side as a consequence of our own decision. Why didn't you?" Vasquez was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't have an answer. She had the answer ready. She was deciding how to say it. "Because they weren't combatants," she said finally. "The crews of those ships were following orders from command structures that decided to engage us. The crews themselves did not individually decide to attack us. Holding the crews responsible for the command decisions didn't make sense to us. So we tried to preserve as many of them as we could." "This is a distinction that very few militaries make in practice," Fress said. "I know," she said. "It cost you resources to make it," he said. "Yes," she said. "Why was it worth the cost?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "Because the crews of those ships are going to go home to their families, and some of them are going to be in a position someday to make decisions about how to respond to conflict, and we would prefer that they have a memory of how this went." She paused. "Additionally, it was the right thing to do." She said the last sentence in exactly the same tone as the first part of her answer, as if the strategic calculation and the ethical one were not two different things, but two ways of describing the same thing. Fress sat back in his chair. I watched him do it, watched the small but visible shift in his posture that told me something had settled in him. He had come to this meeting expecting negotiation. He had instead encountered something he did not have a clean category for. Vasquez pushed the datapad at the center of the table toward the center of the group. "I believe you've all had a chance to read the framework document I shared with Chorith. I'd like to go through the major sections together and address any questions directly. She proceeded to do exactly that for the next 4 hours. And this is the part of the second summit that I find most difficult to describe. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was the opposite. It was the most productive meeting I had attended in 31 years of working in intelligence and diplomacy. And it was productive in a way that meeting rooms are productive when everyone in them has stopped performing and started working. The document, which 4 empires had had access to for varying lengths of time, turned out to have been read at different levels of depth by each delegation. Mern's General Dran had read it most thoroughly, as I had expected. Veth's ambassador Kethorvan had read the sections that affected Veth interests most directly. The Skaran delegation had focused on the territorial provisions. Chorath had read it comprehensively, but with institutional skepticism applied to every clause. What Vasquez did over 4 hours was answer every question that emerged from those 4 different reading approaches simultaneously, without notes, without assistance, without referencing anything except what was in the document itself. She knew every provision. She knew why each provision was drafted the way it was. She knew the data behind each provision, the 30 years of observation that had produced the specific numbers and timelines and territorial demarcations. She had written this. Not alone, obviously, but she had been involved in it deeply enough that she was carrying it in the same way that a person carries something they have built themselves. The legal specialist Elliot Kahn, who had been brought specifically to find exploitable ambiguities, raised 17 specific issues with the document's language. Vasquez addressed 16 of them immediately, and proposed specific revised language for the 17th that Kahn agreed, after careful review, was more precise than what he would have suggested himself. At the 3-hour mark, a member of the Skaran delegation, not High Cleric Orvan, but a younger staff member who had been sitting quietly, said, Section 14, the demilitarized corridor provisions. Yes, Vasquez said. The width of the corridor as specified benefits the Veth Collective's current patrol routes and disadvantages Skaran defensive positioning by approximately 9%. Vasquez nodded. You're correct. That section was drafted as a starting point for negotiation on that specific point. We estimated that the Skaran theocracy would want a corridor width between the values in Section 14 and Section 14A, which is in Appendix 7. Do you have Appendix 7? He looked at his documentation. He did not have Appendix 7. His senior staff also did not have Appendix 7. The appendix had been included in the document as transmitted to Chorath's delegation. I confirmed this when Fress quietly confirmed it to me, but either it had been lost in the Skaran's review process or they had not received the complete document. Vasquez transmitted Appendix 7 to the Skaran delegation's devices without being asked. The young staff member reviewed it, showed it to High Cleric Orvan, and then looked back at Vasquez with an expression that contained more confusion than a Skaran official usually allowed to appear on their face in a formal setting. You anticipated this objection, he said. We anticipated several possible objections and tried to prepare alternatives for each of them, she said. This is one of them. The Skaran official looked at Appendix 7. Then he looked at the main document. Then he looked at Admiral Vasquez. How many appendices are there? 43, she said. Most of them are data supporting the main provisions, but 7 of them are alternative proposals for the sections most likely to require adjustment. 43 appendices. 7 of them containing pre-prepared alternatives for the points most likely to be contested, in a document that had been revised over 11 years. The young Skaran official sat back in his chair and said nothing for a moment. High Cleric Orvan placed his hand briefly on the young man's shoulder, which was, in Skaran culture, a gesture of solidarity. The meeting continued. By hour 4, every delegation had moved from review mode to engagement mode, which is the shift that happens in negotiations when people stop looking for ways to avoid an agreement and start trying to find the specific version of the agreement they can accept. This shift is not guaranteed in any negotiation. It requires a particular combination of circumstances, enough trust, enough clarity about what is on offer, enough understanding that the alternative is worse. All 3 had been provided. Vasquez called a break at the 4-hour mark. Not because anyone asked for one, but because she read the room and assessed that people needed one, and she was right. During the break, I stood near one of the station's viewport panels and looked at the stars. which had been a habit I developed during long meetings when I needed to think. Owen Fress came and stood beside me after a few minutes. "Your reports," he said. "Yes," I said. "I read all of them before this meeting," he said. "I want you to know that I considered them overstated. I thought you had been influenced by proximity to the subject. That is a reasonable concern," I said. "I was wrong," he said. "Your reports were, if anything, understated." I looked at the stars. "I am still processing some things," I said. "The rescue coordinates," he said, "among others." He was quiet for a moment. "The legal specialist, Khan. He found 16 exploitable ambiguities in the first 3 hours." "I was watching," I said. "She addressed all 16 immediately, and the 17th with a revision that he agreed was better than what he would have written," Fress said. "He has been doing contract and treaty law for 14 years. He did not encounter a single clause that she had not anticipated." "No," I agreed. "These people have been writing this document for 11 years, Fress said. "Yes. They have also been in this zone for 30 years, he said, helping everyone, documenting everything, building relationships without announcing they were doing it." "Yes," I said. "And they fought a battle that lasted 11 hours against 212 ships and then provided rescue coordinates during it," he said, "which they had prepared in advance." "Yes." He turned to look at me directly, which was the kind of thing that Fress did when he had arrived at a conclusion and wanted to test it against another person who had arrived there first. "This was never a military situation," he said. "No," I said. "It was never a military situation. The military components were documentation," he said. "They were evidence," I said, "for the real situation." "Which is a negotiation that they have been conducting for 30 years, he said, "and that we have only just realized we are in." I looked at the stars. "And that," I said, "is the most significant sentence I have heard spoken in this entire sequence of events." He returned to the meeting room. I stood at the viewport for another few minutes. Then I went back too, because the break was ending, and Vasquez was already sitting back at the table, looking at the document, patient and present, and ready to continue. The meeting concluded at the 7-hour mark with a preliminary accord initialed by all 4 delegations, not a binding settlement, a framework accord, which committed the parties to a structured negotiation process using the document as the baseline, to be completed within 9 months. When the last signature was placed on the accord, Vasquez looked at all 4 delegations for a moment, with that expression I had never fully named. Then she said, "Thank you. This is a good day." Not congratulations. Not, "We have accomplished something significant." Not any of the formal language that diplomatic signings usually produced. Just, "This is a good day." She meant it, which was the thing about Admiral Vasquez that I had understood from almost the beginning, and had spent this entire sequence of events verifying from every possible angle. She always meant exactly what she said. I wrote in my personal log that night, on the journey back from the neutral station, a note that I would later include in modified form in my final report. "We came to this meeting believing we were dealing with a military situation that required diplomatic management. We were wrong about the category entirely. This has been a negotiation from the beginning. The military engagements were evidence-gathering operations conducted in support of a negotiation that was never announced as such. The humans did not come to the contested zone to fight. They came to resolve a situation that was affecting their interests, and they chose resolution over conflict as their primary mode, because they calculated, correctly, that resolution was more efficient. The fact that they were also more capable of conflict than anyone in the zone had understood is relevant, but secondary. The capability was never the point. The capability was documentation. I read the note twice, then added one more line. "We have been in a negotiation with a civilization patient enough to wait 30 years to start it. I am no longer certain we understand the full scope of what we agreed to today. I will continue to report as understanding develops." The shuttle reached the observation platform as the night cycle began. Outside the viewport, the contested zone was quiet in a way it had not been in 60 years. Not silent. Ships were still moving, supply operations still running, the machinery of military presence still operating, because military organizations do not stop operating just because a political decision has been made. But the quality of the activity was different, quieter, more careful. as if every commander in the zone was waiting for instructions that told them the situation had changed and they should adjust accordingly. I understood the feeling. We were all still adjusting. The Galactic Compact of the Vorkai Contested Zone was signed 11 months and 4 days after the second summit. I was present for the signing. I had been present for every significant moment in the 18 months between the arrival of the human vessel and the final compact, and Colonel Hayan Vor had decided, with the support of the High Council, that continuity of observation mattered enough to keep me assigned to the process, even as more senior diplomatic staff took over the formal negotiation roles. I was, by the end of it, one of the most experienced observers of human diplomatic behavior in Chorath's intelligence apparatus, and possibly in any of the 4 empires, and this was a category that had not existed as a specialization before the human vessel arrived. The signing ceremony was held at the neutral station, which had by that point been refurbished into a functioning facility rather than an abandoned one. The 4 empires had contributed to the refurbishment, each taking sections according to a division of responsibility that was itself a small model of the cooperation the compact was intended to institutionalize. The humans had offered to handle the main meeting room, which they did, and it looked like a room that had been prepared by people who understood the weight of what would happen in it. Nothing showy, nothing ceremonial beyond what was necessary. Good lighting, functional seating, clean surfaces, a central table large enough for every delegation and their required support staff. Admiral Vasquez was present. She was wearing the same dress uniform I had first seen her in at the original meeting, which I noticed because it was still showing the same patch of discoloration on the left sleeve that I had first catalogued nearly 2 years earlier. I considered asking about this, whether it was the same garment or a different one, but decided this was not the most important question I had for her. The signatories went by empire, in alphabetical order by their designation in the compact's own language system, which was a deliberately neutral approach that the human legal team had proposed to avoid any implication of hierarchy in the signing sequence. Every delegation had a representative who placed their mark on the document. Every mark was witnessed by representatives from all other parties. When the last mark was placed, there was a moment of quiet that I recognized as the particular quiet that occurs in rooms where something large and long-awaited has just become real. Not celebration, not yet, because the people in that room were too experienced at managing situations to let celebration override the moment. Just quiet, the held breath of significance. Vasquez said, "Thank you, all of you." Then she said something I had not expected. She said it to the room, addressing no delegation specifically. 60 years is a long time. The people who started this war are mostly not in this room. The people who are in this room have been carrying it. I want to acknowledge that. It's not a small thing to end something that was given to you to carry. The room was quiet for a moment after that, in a different way. The previous quiet had been the quiet of significance. This quiet had the quality of something acknowledged, something seen by someone outside it, and named clearly, and the naming had given the people in the room permission to feel the weight of what they had been carrying, in a way that formal settings usually did not permit. High Cleric Orvan, who had arrived at every meeting since the engagement with the combined fleet in a state of careful and somewhat chastened attentiveness that was very different from his initial posture, said, "Do you know how long 60 years is for a Skaran?" "About 2/3 of an average lifespan," Vasquez said. She had not needed to calculate this. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father was a young soldier when the war began. He is not alive now. My generation has never known this zone without conflict." "I know," she said. "You know my father's name?" he asked. Orvan Keshetmir. He served in the Skaran Theocracy's Eastern Defense Command. He was recovered from a damaged vessel by our ship approximately 23 years ago and returned to Skaran-controlled space. He looked at her for a long moment. I watched his face do something controlled people's faces rarely do in formal settings. It went through several expressions in rapid succession, each one genuine, before settling into something that I can only describe as profound adjustment. "He survived that," he said. "He told us it was a rescue by a neutral vessel of unknown origin. He did not know who helped him. We kept careful records," she said, "but we had reasons at the time to not identify ourselves fully." "He passed away 4 years ago," Orvan said. "He talked about that rescue. More than you would expect." "I'm sorry he's not here," she said. "I'm glad you are." She meant it. Everything she said, she meant. The formal proceedings concluded, and the various delegations moved toward the brief reception that had been organized in an adjacent space. I found myself beside the viewport again, which had become my default position when I needed to think in places that had viewports. The stars outside were the same stars they had always been, completely indifferent to what had just happened in the room behind me. I found this comforting. Admiral Vasquez came and stood beside me. We did not say anything for a moment. This was comfortable in a way that I had learned, over the course of our various interactions, was one of her qualities. She did not fill silence with words when silence was serving a function. "You're writing the full report," she said eventually. It was not a question. "I have been writing it throughout," I said. "The final version will take some time." "What is the central conclusion going to be?" she asked. I considered this. I had been building toward the conclusion for months, adding to it as events provided new evidence, refining the language as my understanding developed. I had not stated it plainly to anyone yet. That humanity is the apex predator of the galaxy, I said. Not because of military capacity, though the capacity is significant. Not because of technological advantage, though the gap is larger than any of us understood. Because of a combination of qualities that no other species in the known database has successfully produced in the same individual civilization. She was quiet, listening. "Patience," I said. "Not the patience that comes from limited options or forced waiting, but the patience of a species that is comfortable with very long timelines and understands that the work done at the beginning of a process shapes every outcome at the end. You have been working on this situation for 30 years, and you had the plan for the resolution before you came here. This implies a civilization that thinks in generations about specific tactical situations. This is unprecedented in the database." I continued. "Adaptability, the capacity to absorb damage, setback, pressure, and uncertainty without abandoning the primary approach. Every other predator origin species in the database responds to significant threat by escalating or retreating. You responded to a 212-ship engagement by following the same principles you established in the first engagement, at different scale. The threat was 30 times larger. The response was proportional, not reactive." She did not interrupt. "Emotional complexity," I said. "This is the one I found hardest to articulate. Most species suppress emotional complexity in military and diplomatic contexts because it is inefficient and creates vulnerability. You do not suppress it. High Cleric Orvan's comment about his father, and your response to it, was not strategic. You genuinely knew who his father was, and what happened to him, and you chose to share that because the moment called for it, not because it advanced your position. Your position was already secured. You shared it because it was true, and because it mattered to him." "It did matter to him," she said quietly. "Yes," I said, "and the fact that you understood it would, and that you said it anyway, in a formal setting, where most civilizations would have reserved it for a private conversation later, or never said it at all, is the quality I have struggled most to name. It is not weakness. It is not naivety. It is the capacity to act on what is true and what is right simultaneously, without requiring these to be different things." She was looking at the stars. "The willingness to absorb pain," I continued. "This may be the most specifically predator-derived quality of the set. Every predator origin species tolerates physical hardship better than herbivore origin species. This is expected from the evolutionary history. What is not expected is the degree to which your species appears to apply this quality psychologically, institutionally, and strategically. You allowed yourselves to be attacked to establish a legal record. You took 11 hours of engagement from 212 ships to produce a documented outcome. You carried a 30-year operation in difficult space without announcing it, and without the institutional acknowledgement that most organizations require to sustain long-term effort. This is not simply tolerating discomfort. This is systematically choosing a harder path because the harder path produces a better outcome. The harder path," she said softly, "usually produces a better outcome. That's been our experience." "And finally," I said, "generational thinking. The capacity to plan for outcomes that will manifest not in this administration or this generation, but in future ones, and to take the specific actions required now to produce those future outcomes, without requiring the present generation to experience the reward. The compact signed today is not the endpoint of your strategic plan for this region. It is a milestone in a plan that will continue after everyone in that room is gone. I am certain of this, though I cannot prove it." She was quiet for a moment. "You are correct," she said. "I know," I said. We stood at the viewport for a while longer. The stars were still indifferent. The reception was still occurring in the adjacent room, and I could hear the sounds of it, the multiple languages, and the careful social maneuvering of representatives from 4 empires, learning how to be in the same room, without hostility. "I have a question," I said. "All right," she said. "At the original meeting," I said, "you smiled when we all came in. Not the way a diplomat smiles, the genuine version." "Yes," she said. "You were pleased to see us," I said. "Actually pleased. Not because we were strategically useful, or because our arrival confirmed something, though it must have confirmed something. Actually pleased. Why?" She thought about this. She did not give quick answers to questions she took seriously. "We had been watching this war for 30 years, she said. "We had read every intelligence file, tracked every fleet movement, studied every command decision. We knew what the war looked like from the outside. We had spent a long time with the question of whether the people fighting it had the capacity to stop." She paused. "When you all showed up at that meeting, you were scared. All 4 of you, in your different ways. And that told me something I had hoped was true, but couldn't confirm from observation data." "What did it tell you?" I said. "That you wanted something else," she said. "Scared people want something else. People who are satisfied with the situation don't get scared when it changes. You were all scared, which meant you were all, on some level, hoping it could be different. That is the condition you need before a negotiation can work. You can't negotiate with a party that is happy with the status quo. You needed us to be afraid," I said. "We needed you to be honest," she said. "Fear is honest." I thought about that. "You were not afraid," I said. "No," she said. "Why not?" She turned to look at me, and she had the expression she had been wearing for the entire duration of my acquaintance with her. Warm, present, entirely unperformed. "Because we had done the work," she said simply. "When you have done all the work there is to do, there is nothing left to be afraid of. Either it works, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, you figure out what work you missed, and you do that." She looked at the stars again. "It worked." "Yes," I said. "It worked." She returned to the reception. I stayed at the viewport for a few more minutes, writing notes in my head that I would later transfer to the final report. The last sections of the report, the ones that I spent the most time on and revised the most times, were the sections that attempted to describe the full significance of what humanity represented to the known galaxy. The final report was 412 pages. Its central argument took the whole of the document to build, but its conclusion was stated in a single paragraph that I wrote and rewrote 11 times before I was satisfied with it. Humanity is the apex predator of the known galaxy. This classification does not rest on military capacity, technological superiority, or numerical advantage, though humanity demonstrates competence in all 3. It rests on a quality that no other species in the catalog database has produced at the civilizational level: the combination of predatory patience, adaptive resilience, emotional complexity, and generational planning sufficient to make conflict, in the long run, unnecessary. The apex predator does not need to fight every challenge. It shapes the terrain so that challenges become negotiations. It is patient enough to wait for others to realize this, and it is old enough, in its bones, to know that the best outcome is one where everyone walks away having gained something, because that is the outcome that lasts. We invited them to prove themselves. They proved something larger. They proved that the measure of the galaxy's greatest predator is not how many enemies it can defeat, but how many it can turn into neighbors. I sent the report to Vor on a Tuesday, which is when I always sent significant reports, and he acknowledged receipt with 3 words. I'll read carefully. 2 years after the compact was signed, I encountered Admiral Vasquez again at a trade summit in neutral space. She was heading a small delegation, negotiating the first formal commerce agreements between human territory and the former contested zone, which had been reorganized under the compact into a jointly administered region with its own governance structure. She saw me across the reception hall and navigated through the crowd toward me with the same directional efficiency she applied to everything, She shook my hand, which is a human greeting gesture I had learned about in the xenobiology files and now experienced as the warm and direct thing it apparently was intended to be. "Vale Reth," she said, "how is the family?" I had a brief moment of surprise, because I had not told her anything about my family during any of our meetings. My personal information was not in any of the files she should have had access to. "They are well," I said. "Thank you. Your daughter is studying political science at the Chorath Institute," she said. "She wrote a paper on the compact negotiations last year. One of my staff forwarded it to me. She has good instincts." She had reviewed my daughter's academic work. She had prepared, before this chance encounter at a trade summit, to ask about my family. She had done the research so that the question would be genuine, rather than generic. I looked at her for a moment and thought about everything I had written in the final report, and everything I had observed across 2 years, and more than a dozen meetings in some of the most consequential circumstances I had ever worked through. "You prepared for this conversation," I said. "I prepare for most conversations," she said. "It's a habit." "You prepared to make me feel like a person," I said. She met my eyes. "You are a person," she said. "That doesn't require preparation. The preparation is just so I don't accidentally forget something that matters to you." I stood in that reception hall with the sounds of a trade summit around me, representatives of formerly warring empires negotiating commerce in a zone that had been a battlefield 3 years ago, and I thought about the final line of my report. "The best outcome is one where everyone walks away having gained something, because that is the outcome that lasts." She had said it differently, years before I wrote it. She had said, "You are a person and I prepared so I don't forget what matters to you." Same principle, different scale. That was humanity. The same principle, applied from the smallest possible interaction to the largest possible political structure, without losing the thread. A civilization that treated individuals as worthy of preparation, and treated galactic conflicts as worthy of the same care, and saw no contradiction between the two. We had invited them to the galaxy's table to show them where they ranked. They had sat down, understood the room in 30 seconds, spent 30 years doing the homework, and quietly made themselves indispensable to every person at the table. We had not lost a war. We had not been conquered. We had been outthought, outplanned, outcared, and then included. We had not even noticed the difference until it was complete. I looked at Admiral Vasquez, who was already scanning the room to see where she needed to be next, already calculating, already preparing, already 100 small steps ahead of the visible situation. "Admiral," I said. She looked back at me. "You knew from the beginning that it would work," I said. "The whole sequence, the arrival, the meeting, the engagements, the summit, the compact. You knew it would work." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We knew it could work. Knowing it could is what made the preparation worth doing." She smiled, the same expression she had worn in every meeting, warm and unperformed, and entirely genuine. "Vale Reth," she said, "it was genuinely good to see you." She meant it. She always meant it. That, in the end, was the thing I could not fully quantify in any report. The sheer, systematic, civilizational commitment to meaning what you said, to preparing carefully enough that when you spoke, everything you said was true, to treating each person as someone who deserved accurate information and genuine attention. In 412 pages, I had described everything else: the patience, the military capacity, the long horizon planning, the documentation strategy, the generational thinking. All of it was in the report, sourced and analyzed and argued. The thing I could not fully put in the report was simpler than any of it. It was this: the galaxy had spent a very long time measuring civilizations by how much damage they could cause. Humanity had arrived and demonstrated, quietly and thoroughly and without ever making it a speech, that the correct measure was different. The correct measure was how much they could prevent. How much care they could sustain over 30 years in difficult space. How many people they could bring home. I wrote that, in my personal log, on the night after the trade summit, not in the report, in my own words, for my own record. Then I closed the log and looked out the viewport at the stars, which were the same stars they had always been, and thought, we did not understand what we were looking at until it was already inside the galaxy with us. I am still not certain we fully understand it now. I am, however, certain of one thing. I am very glad it is on our side.